Welcome to OSM Fencing Beginner's Foil. I'll be your coach, Orion Stowe-McNeil. This is part 3 to our 4-part introduction to beginner's foil. In this lesson, we will be focusing on defense. Let's get started. Defense comes in two primary forms in foil: movement and parries. Now I'm only going to talk quickly about movement. The primary way that movement plays a role in our defense is the retreat. When someone marches forward, they step forward, you step back. It's as simple as that. If you want to know more about how movement plays a role in defense, make sure you follow this lesson up with Annex 3. It'll go into greater detail. Part 2 though, the parry, that's what we're going to be focusing on. Now the parry is very important because that's how you gain control of your opponent's action, by using your foil to capture their attack. Think of it again as playing catch or dodgeball. If we follow the analogy from Annex 2, if I have the ball in dodgeball and I throw it at you, you getting hit, that's me getting a point. Me missing, that's me just finishing my action. Now, the parry is when you actually catch the ball. So if I throw it at you, that's my attack. You parry, you catch the ball. Now you have right of way, you're in charge. You are now the person who can take the action. So that's where the parry is very important. If you are retreating, you never get right of way, but if you parry, that's how you take over right of way. So let's have a quick talk about how right of way comes into play with our defense. When we're looking at defense and taking right of way away from our opponent, it is only really achievable through the parry. Now, that is when your opponent attacks you, they have right of way, you can steal it, take it away from them by making an effective parry. So following our dodgeball metaphor, the parry is the catching of the ball. Once you catch it, you're in charge, you can throw it, you can make your own attack. If you don't make the parry, you can never really make your attack. Your opponent will remain in control. So the parry is very important in taking right of way away from them. So remember, the parry is the defensive game equivalent of making an attack. You have to make the parry before you can hit your opponent. If you don't have right of way, this is how you take right of way from your opponent. Now that we know the two aspects of this lesson, let's make sure we are prepared to get underway. So remember, you do need your protective gear. Make sure you have your foil, your glove, make sure you're wearing a mask, and your jacket. I'm going to be assisted in this lesson by Elizagada Tong again, so make sure you follow the examples that we're both giving you. Let's get started with our parries. Now before we start our parries, it's very important that we understand the anatomy of our foil blade. There are two parts to it. The center down, this is our fort. This is the strongest section of our blade. This is where we make our parries. The center up, this is called our foible. This is the weakest part of our blade. This is where we make our attacks. Now, the reason why we use our fort as our defensive position is because we can control it. If I'm trying to make a parry with my foible, I cannot control it. I can't control their blade. I'm pushing, but I'm not moving my opponent. So if I want to make a parry, I cannot use the foible, I have to use the fort. It's much easier to take control of your opponent's blade and change its line. So again, when you're making the parry, you do so with the fort, not the foil. Before we get started with our parries, let's make sure we understand how much we are going to be moving our blade. In your on guard position, you are going to be traversing across your target, starting with your elbow, so that the blade is now positioned on the inside line. And then if you have to parry to the outside line, it's the same movement, starting with the elbow, just like that. So make sure when you are making your parries, it is a nice transfer from side to side. Now that we know where we can make an effective parry along our blade, let's talk about the 4 parries that we have to be familiar with in foil. Now, these 4 parries follow our 4 lines, the inside and outside line, the high line, and the low line. The first 2 parries we're going to be looking at are our high line. This is parry 4 and parry 6. Parry 4 is going to be a high line that favors following the inside line, and parry 6 is a high line that follows favoring the outside line. Let's have a look at these 2 lines. So in this position, this is a parry 4. The opponent is attacking your inside line, and as you can see, I'm making a parry with the forte of my blade against the foible of their blade. This allows me to control their blade and close the line. If I step in, I cannot get hit. This is a good example of a parry 6. As you can see, it's a high line that's favoring the outside line. Again, I'm parrying with the forte of my blade against the foible of my opponents. It gives me control, and again, I can step in and the blade cannot hit me. So it allows me to control my opponent's line. Our next 2 parries are parry 7 and parry 8. These are our low line parries. Parry 7 favors the low line to the inside line position, and parry 8 is the low line favoring the outside line. Let's have a look at these 2 parries. This is a parry 7. As you can see, my opponent is attacking my inside line. I again have to make the parry with the forte. Now what you'll notice that's different here from the high line is that my blade has to be pointing down. If it's pointing up, I can't find the blade. I have to position it so the point is facing down. That way, when the attack is on its way, I don't have any trouble finding it. It's the same thing with the high line. The blade points up with the high line, blade points down with the low line. This is a parry 8. Now again, as you can see, just like the parry 7, my wrist is dropping the point so it's facing down. I'm parrying with the forte of my blade against the foible of my opponents. Gives me control so that if I am to step in, the blade cannot hit me, I remain safe. Now that we know our 4 parries and how they work, let's talk a little bit about what we do after we make the parry. Now, if your opponent makes the attack against you and you parry them, that's great. But what happens afterwards? When you make the parry, you are taking right of way. You have priority. So what you do with, you're going to make what we call a riposte. Now the riposte is the defender's attack. That's where you, now having right of way, can make an attack against your opponent's target. So let's have a look at how the riposte works. Now this is the riposte. I've extended my arm in line to make the attack, and I've been parried. As soon as I get parried, my opponent is going to follow with a riposte, which is their own attack against me. So after every parry, you want to finish with a riposte. If you don't finish with a riposte, you are essentially just giving up your right of way. One important thing to note about the riposte is where you can land it. Now it goes without saying that you don't want to actively make your riposte to the inside line. Obviously from our last lesson, we did talk about how that can flatten out. The target's farther away, it's more difficult to hit. So this means we want to focus on the outside line because it is the most forward and closest to us when we're fencing. Now, this is where you can hit on the outside line. If you are facing your opponent and they are taller than you, you are going to want to make that parry, and then the riposte is going to be to the low line. However, if they are shorter than you are, and you make that same parry, your riposte is going to go to the high line, so the path of least resistance. If you're both approximately the same height, you're just going to want to see which way is the fastest approach. But again, always focus on the outside line, and regardless of what parry you're making, you want to go to the area that isn't being protected. The riposte will work regardless of what line you're parrying in. Just make sure that it is immediately following the parry. If you make the parry and you hesitate, you don't immediately extend your arm for the riposte, you risk being timed out by your opponent who's going to continue their attack. So again, you want to make the parry and immediately follow with the riposte. Now, let's talk a little bit about movement with our parries, including the riposte. Movement is particularly important when you're defending. If your opponent is marching or lunging, if you stand in place, you are shortening the time you have to make a parry. That is, when they lunge, if you're standing still, you're not going to be able to give yourself enough time to find your opponent's blade. However, if you make a step back as a retreat when you are searching, when you're making your parry, this gives you more time to find your opponent's blade and then make the riposte. But the important thing here, you want to make sure you can retain right of way. So if you make the parry and you keep retreating, you lose right of way. So let's have a look at how we can do a parry while retreating and keeping right of way. The first movement we're going to be looking at is the lunge. So I'm going to get lunged at. I'm going to take a half step back with my parry. Now, in this situation, my half step opens up the distance just a little bit so I have more time to find my opponent's blade, but it doesn't give up my right of way. I haven't continued to retreat, so as soon as I make the parry, I'm now going to make my own lunge as my riposte. Alright, now let's have a look at that same lunge, but this time I'm going to do a full step back in my retreat. Watch where I make my parry. Now again, I've stepped back with both feet, but my parry is happening at the same time. It's not happening after the retreat. And then I extend my arm and make my own riposte in the lunge. We're going to now look at the movement in the form of a march. Now, when I march forward, she's going to make the retreat, but she's going to make her parry at the same time. Now, as you can see, the parry is still happening at the same time as she takes her step back, so she's not losing right of way. If she parries and then steps back, she can lose right of way. So it has to be continuous action. It's going to be a parry with the step back, followed immediately by the riposte. And this maintains your priority, so you will get the point. Excellent. So now we know how to make a parry, we know how to make a riposte, and we know how to put that into our movement. Now what we're going to do is incorporate all of that into a series of drills. Now, when you are following these drills, make sure you continue to practice them over and over and over again until you feel confident in the action. But remember, timing is very important, so you want to make your parry in the same time that you're making your retreat, and you want your riposte to be immediately following your parry. Thanks guys, you were great. I hope you enjoyed this video and that you got a lot from this lesson and worked really hard in the drills. I apologize though, we did breeze through a lot of the content in this lesson, so make sure you do follow it up with Annex 3. There's a lot of information in there. It's going to be talking a lot about movement and how that plays a role in your defensive game, so very important you have a look at that. And as always, keep practicing. Stay tuned for part 4, our 4th lesson. It's going to be our last one for this series. And I'd like to thank Ali Zagatatong for helping out again. She was great, and I hope you guys appreciated her work. I'll see you for the next lesson.